sir. Good day, classmates. So we are here to report our topic, the Module 3, which is entitled, Who are the Indigenous People in the Philippines? So I am assigned to discuss the first topic, which is entitled, Why There is a Need for Definitions. So let's start. So in the first slide, the flexible definitional people can enhance the human rights protections of IP groups or indigenous people and communities. So the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples strongly suggests that the rights of indigenous peoples need to be upheld and protected even with the absence of a formal definitions. So indigenous people are, we all know that these are the distinct social and cultural groups that share collective and ancestral ties to the lands and natural resources where they live and so on. So after we experience colonizations from different countries like Spanish, we also mix from their races and being apart for different places or region. So United Nations says no matter what, we were not recognized or being defined as what we are. It always important that we are being respected as what rights that indigenous peoples has. They have a right to be protected. So of course they have the rights to be acknowledged and to be protect, because indigenous peoples, they are the first people who bring our cultures existed until now. So they are our origins who stays in our country. I think importante yung identification sa indigenous people, kasi tayo nga yung mga normal na tao is may mga identification. Meron tayong mga pangalan, identity at kung ano-ano pa man para lang tayo makilala ng ibang tao at ibang grupo ng komunidad. So the next slide is the International Working Group for Indigenous Affairs outlined 3 primary nationalists for a clear and well-defined conceptualization of indigenous peoples. So these are the 3 rationales or the reason why they conceptualize indigenous people. So the first rationale is the self-identification, which means an essential component of the IP sense of identity. Thus, without a well-defined and universally acceptable definition and criterion, IP self-identification is indefinite and doubtful. So this is one of the rationales with this statement. It says that essential component, it means that IP's identity is important to shares from everybody and over the world of what identity they have, like Igorot, Mangyan, and other tribal groups. So the second rationale, it will be easier for them to be accepted as belonging to the IP classification. So this second rationale refers to the status of the indigenous to ensure that the IPs are in stable and in a good condition, because we are responsible to protect and respect what they are, and of course we have the right to help them, and it is the way we recognize the rights, the cultures, and other livings of indigenous people. But at some point, indigenous people are experience a higher level of marginalization, and the one is discrimination. So what is marginalization? It means you are on the fringes of society, excluded or isolated. Aside from IP, sample of marginalization are the self-employed or those working in family workshops, jeepney drivers, and the rural works like fisher works and farmers, ethnic minorities, and the people with physical and mental disabilities. Then discrimination means the unfair of prejudicial and groups based on the characteristics such as race, gender, age, or sexual orientation. Example, they are denied control over their own development based on their own values, needs, and priorities. So they are politically underrepresented and lack access to social and other services. So in other words, they are often face exclusion, loss of ancestral lands, displacement, pressures to the destruction of traditional ways of life and practices, and loss of identity and culture. So the third one, it says that a clear definition of indigenous people will provide indigenous people the opportunity to be heard and seen by the local and international government and enable them to assert the right to self-determination. So in this third rationalis, it says the self-definitions. So what is the self-determination? So it means the indigenous peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. So in other words, the indigenous peoples wants to preserve what they have right now in future generation in terms of their ancestors, cultures, and so on, to be recognized and the fully of the indigenous people. So after the sacrifice they made, they wanted to have their own home for their ethnic identity. So let's come now to the next slide, which is the underlying issues in the naming of the indigenous peoples groups. Is that most often the name associated with them is also employed as a derogatory term to address them. So in the case of the Aitas or Itas in Pampanga, they are referred to as Baluga or black people, similar to the case of the Sama people being called Siyamal or dirty. So in this statement, it gives me pain about the issues faced by the indigenous people. So it was real that indigenous people are made to all different names which are not necessary to. We are experienced to hear that terms Baluga, and it means the black people, or it says the Igorot. So and this term Siyamal, which means dirty. So I think that was so offending and annoying from that side of the understanding from the indigenous peoples. So palagay ko it is one of the type of disrespect. So of course, when we are side of the indigenous people, kung tayo yun, sabihan tayo ng mga pangalan na hindi naman kailangan itawag sa atin, ay ma-offend tayo at ma-annoyed sa mga sinasabi ng ibang tao kasi hindi naman tayo nila kilala. We move on to the next slide. So I think this is the last slide. So the existence of the derogatory remarks and other forms of discriminations necessitates that need for a well-defined conceptualization of indigenous people. So in this statement that those derogatory remarks and discriminations which experienced by indigenous peoples, it's totally need for have an accurate judgment. So sabi mo nga kanina, we need to understand them first. So it is because those are humors from other people based on this saw, and based on how people describe the indigenous people. So it needs an conceptualization to avoid this kind of issues. So that's all my report from the first topic of module 3. So the next topic is reported by Jumel Kapangpangan, Mr. Jumel Kapangpangan. Then that's all my report. Thank you for listening.